In the heart of 15th century Europe, where kingdoms rose and fell under the weight of swords and shifting alliances, there was a boy. A boy born into shadows, born into betrayal, born into fire. His name was Vlad. To some, he would become a savior. To others, a monster. And to the world, he would be remembered by a single, terrible name, the Impaler. But to understand the man who would later decorate forests with human corpses, we must first step back into the cruel crucible that forged him. Wallachia, a land of mountains and forests, a kingdom of crossroads. It was here that Vlad was born in 1431, in the fortified city of Sigosora. His father was Vlad II, a prince bound by loyalty not just to his people, but to a secret brotherhood known as the Order of the Dragon. This chivalric order had sworn to defend Christian Europe from the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire. From the very beginning, Vlad's life was entwined with blood oaths, holy wars, and political intrigue. Vlad II, known as Dracula, the dragon, passed his name to his son. And so the boy was called Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon. But the world Vlad was born into was no fairy tale. The borders of Wallachia were pressure points between East and West, Christian and Muslim, Hungary and the Ottomans. Alliances were written in ink one day and washed away in blood the next. Princes were puppets to greater powers, and loyalty was bought with gold, or broken with steel. From his earliest years, Vlad saw betrayal as natural as the turning of seasons. His father, Vlad Dracula, played a dangerous game of double allegiance, swearing loyalty to both the Hungarian king and the Ottoman sultan. To survive in this world meant never trusting fully, never resting, never showing weakness. And for the young Vlad, weakness would be punished in ways unimaginable. At the age of 11, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken as hostages by the Ottoman Empire. Their father, desperate to hold his throne, handed them over to the Sultan Murad II. For years, the boys lived in captivity, not in dungeons, but in gilded prisons. They were educated, groomed, and watched. Their lives were a constant reminder to their father, "Betray us, and your sons will pay the price." Imagine the mind of a child in such a place. Every smile from a guard could hide a blade. Every lesson in strategy, every story of power, was laced with threat. Vlad learned Arabic, Turkish, the arts of war, the ways of court diplomacy. But he also learned cruelty. Ottoman punishments were brutal, executions public and creative. Impalement, the punishment that would later become his signature, was not foreign to him. Here he absorbed it all, storing fear, pain, and humiliation deep within him. And as he grew, he sharpened his hatred into a weapon. His younger brother Radu responded differently. Radu bent, smiled, adapted. He charmed the Ottomans and earned the nickname, Radu the Handsome. But Vlad? He resisted. He brooded. He endured beatings, humiliations, isolation. He refused to bend. That defiance became his identity, and it festered into something darker than mere stubbornness. It became vengeance waiting for its hour. While the boys lived in foreign custody, tragedy struck at home. Their father, Vlad Dracula, was assassinated by his rivals in Wallachia. Their elder brother Mircea was brutally tortured and buried alive. The boy who had once been the son of a dragon was now the son of ashes. For Vlad, this was the ultimate betrayal. By nobles, by neighbors, by the cruel hand of politics. And he swore that when he returned, the world would know his wrath. By the time Vlad was released and returned to Wallachia, he was no longer a boy. He was a scarred young man, burning with a single purpose: reclaim what was stolen and punish those who had betrayed his blood. But in Wallachia, power was not simply seized. It had to be clawed out of the hands of enemies who waited like vultures. The throne shifted constantly, like a chair placed in the middle of a storm. Vlad's first reign was short, a flicker of power extinguished almost as quickly as it was lit. But even in those early days, he revealed his true nature, merciless, cunning, and utterly unafraid of blood. This is where the legend begins to form. A boy torn from his family. A prince raised among enemies. A soul carved open by betrayal. These experiences did not just shape Vlad, they defined him. His childhood was a furnace, and the man who emerged from its flames was harder than iron. When we look at Vlad the Impaler, we see a man who loved watching death. But beneath that horror is a child who watched powerlessness, who saw the cruelty of the world before he could even hold a sword. And when he finally grasped one, he vowed never again to be weak. This is only the beginning. The boy has survived captivity. The young man has tasted betrayal. But soon, he will claim the throne again, and this time, he will not let go. What follows is a reign that will stain the forests of Wallachia with blood, a reign that will terrify Europe, and a reign that will etch his name into history forever. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he was no longer a hostage, no longer a pawn in another man's game. He was a prince with scars etched into his soul and a single burning obsession: vengeance. The boy who had once been traded like a coin was determined to claim what had been denied him: the throne, the crown, and above all, respect through fear. Wallachia in the mid-15th century was not a kingdom of peace. It was a cauldron. Two great powers, the Hungarian kingdom in the west and the Ottoman Empire in the east, each demanded loyalty. Wallachia was their buffer state, a prize to be controlled, a pawn to be sacrificed. Its princes lived in a constant state of uncertainty. Obey too much, and you were a slave. Resist too much, and you were crushed. But Vlad had no desire to be a pawn. He wanted to be feared, and in fear, he believed lay freedom. His first taste of power had been brief, barely more than a whisper. Supported by the Ottomans after his father's death, Vlad managed to seize the throne of Wallachia in 1448. But the throne was no fortress, it was a seat of fire. Within months, rival claimants and noble factions ousted him. Vlad fled, humiliated yet alive. For many men, such a failure would be the end. But for Vlad, it was fuel. Every setback, every betrayal was added to the fire burning inside him. He would not stop. He would wait, sharpen his blade, and strike again. The years that followed were restless and bloody. Vlad moved like a shadow through the fractured politics of Eastern Europe, sometimes aligning with Hungary, sometimes with local lords, sometimes with outlaws who shared his thirst for revenge. He was patient, watching the nobles who had betrayed his father, marking their names, remembering their families. And then, when opportunity returned, Vlad struck with a fury that the land of Wallachia had never seen before. One of Vlad's first acts upon reclaiming the throne in 1456 was not to hold a feast or proclaim unity, but to punish. He invited the boyars, the powerful noble class who had betrayed his father and brother, to a great banquet. The tables were heavy with food, the air thick with wine. But beneath the surface lay death. As the nobles feasted, Vlad's soldiers surrounded the hall. At his signal, many of the boyars were seized. Some were executed on the spot. Others were forced on a long march into the Carpathian Mountains, where they were put to work building Vlad's fortress at Poenary. Few survived. This was not simply vengeance. It was a message. In Wallachia, betrayal would no longer be repaid with negotiation. It would be repaid with blood. Vlad's philosophy of rule emerged clearly in these early acts. Where other princes tried to win loyalty through gifts, promises, or alliances, Vlad demanded it through terror. His logic was simple: fear does not waver. Fear does not betray. And so, Wallachia began to change under his hand. Crime was punished with immediate death. Thieves, liars, and adulterers found themselves hanging from gallows or worse, impaled on wooden stakes, their bodies left to rot as warnings. Corruption among officials was stamped out through the same merciless means. To Vlad, justice was not a blindfolded figure holding scales. Justice was a sharpened stake. But there was more to his terror than cruelty alone. Beneath the horror lay a brutal kind of order. For the first time in years, travelers could cross Wallachia's roads without fear of bandits. Merchants could trade without being robbed. Villages could sleep knowing the lawless were being crushed. It was as if Vlad had decided that to build a strong Wallachia, he must first burn out every weed, no matter how much blood soaked the soil. Still, His cruelty was not random. Each punishment carried a lesson. When merchants tried to cheat the people with false weights, Vlad had the offenders impaled with their very scales hanging from their necks. When a noblewoman was accused of infidelity, she was skinned alive. In Vlad's world, terror was not chaos, it was law carved into flesh. For the common people, Vlad became a strange paradox. He was both protector and monster. They whispered of his cruelties with trembling voices, but they also knew their roads were safer, their goods untaken, their lives more secure than under weaker rulers. To peasants who had been crushed for generations between nobles and invaders, Vlad was both savior and executioner. To his enemies, he was a demon. To his people, he was a shield of thorns. To himself, he was justice incarnate. But Vlad's reign was not confined to Wallachia alone. Beyond his borders, the Ottomans were watching. The great empire, stretching across continents, demanded tribute from Wallachia, gold, grain, and sometimes children for their armies. Vlad, who had once been their hostage, knew the price of submission. And he would not pay it willingly. Defiance against the Ottomans was not a small gesture. It was a death wish. Yet Vlad, hardened by captivity and fueled by vengeance, was unafraid. His throne had been won through blood, and he would defend it with oceans more. And so the stage was set for a conflict that would transform Vlad from a cruel local ruler into a figure of continental terror. The boy who had once been forced to bow to the Ottoman Sultan would rise against the empire itself. The years of waiting, of humiliation, of fire boiling under his skin, they were over. Vlad had his throne. He had his enemies in sight, and now the world was about to meet not just a prince of Wallachia, but a master of fear. The dragon's son had returned, and he was ready to breathe fire. When Vlad Dracula reclaimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456, he knew one truth with absolute certainty: weakness was death. And he would never be weak again. His kingdom had to be strong, unyielding, disciplined. But in a land riddled with treachery and lawlessness, what weapon could bind loyalty? What force could secure order? For Vlad, the answer was terror. From the moment he ascended, Vlad began crafting not just a rule, but an atmosphere, a climate of fears so pervasive that even whispers against him died in the throats of men. His punishments were infamous, but behind the spectacle lay a grim calculation. Terror was not chaos for its own sake. Terror was policy. Travelers who entered Wallachia quickly learned its new laws. Theft? Death. Adultery? Death. Fraud? Death. Corruption? Death. And not death by sword, but death by stake. Impalement, the gruesome punishment where victims were pierced on sharpened poles and left to suffer for hours, even days. The sight of forests of stakes became Vlad's signature, his calling card, his iron seal stamped upon the land. But the strange, chilling truth is that it worked. Merchants could now pass through Wallachia without fear of being robbed. A story circulated, one that echoed across Europe. Vlad once placed a golden goblet at a public well in Targovist, the capital. It remained untouched for years. Why? Because in Vlad's Wallachia, even the thought of stealing was enough to conjure visions of a slow, agonizing death. Justice under Vlad was swift, merciless, and absolute. Nobles who had betrayed his father, who had grown fat while peasants starved, found themselves stripped, humiliated, and executed. Corrupt officials were impaled with their ledgers tied around their necks. Vlad was not interested in compromise. To him, compromise was weakness, and weakness bred treachery. And yet, in this forest of fear, ordinary life began to bloom. Roads became safe. Markets bustled. Farmers harvested without dread of bandits. For the first time in living memory, Wallachia was not merely surviving, it was stable. The paradox of Vlad Dracula emerges here in full. To his enemies, he was a butcher, a sadist, a monster in human skin. To his peasants, he was protector, avenger, the hand of iron that shielded them from those who had long abused them. His cruelty was their safety net, his violence their law. What does it mean when a ruler must become a monster to protect his people? Was Vlad a tyrant drunk on blood? Or was he a shield sharpened into a blade? But there was more driving Vlad than mere policy. His reign was deeply personal, carved by the traumas of his past. Every betrayal he suffered, every humiliation he endured, resurfaced in his rulings. To Vlad, treachery was not just a crime, it was the ultimate sin. And the punishment for sin was always death. This obsession with loyalty shaped his most infamous deeds. Nobles who had switched allegiances too often, who bent with every shifting wind, found themselves skewered on stakes. Entire families were executed, their lands seized, their names erased. Vlad sought not only to eliminate traitors but to erase the very possibility of betrayal from Wallachian memory. Yet Vlad's terror was not limited to punishment. He also pursued reforms. He standardized taxes, sought to strengthen fortresses, and reinforced the Orthodox Church's role in Wallachian life. He demanded discipline not just from nobles but from commoners as well. Peasants were expected to work, to contribute, to obey. Laziness, too, could mean death. For Vlad, the state was a living body. And in his mind, parasites, be they corrupt nobles or idle peasants, had to be cut away. But Vlad's reign of terror could not be confined within his borders. For beyond Wallachia lay the shadow of empire, the Ottomans, ever watchful, ever demanding. Tribute had been paid to them for decades, gold flowing eastward as the price of survival. But Vlad, molded by years of Ottoman captivity, loathed the very thought of bowing to them. When emissaries from the Ottoman Sultan arrived to demand tribute, Vlad greeted them coldly. They refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing their customs. Vlad, with a smile as sharp as his blade, ordered the turbans nailed to their heads. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Wallachia would no longer kneel. Defiance meant war. And war with the Ottomans was no small matter. They commanded vast armies, disciplined and countless, led by generals hardened across continents. Vlad commanded a small principality, a land of forests and mountains, its soldiers brave but few. How could Wallachia resist? Through fear. Vlad pioneered what we might now call psychological warfare. He used his cruelty as a weapon not just against criminals, but against invaders. As Ottoman forces marched into Wallachia, they found villages deserted, food stores burned, wells poisoned. And on the roads they found stakes. Thousands of them. Entire forests of the dead. Men, women, children, soldiers, all impaled. It was not merely execution. It was theater. A nightmare turned into landscape. And it worked. Ottoman soldiers, hardened by years of conquest, trembled as they marched deeper into this land of horror. The sight of thousands of corpses swaying on stakes in the wind was enough to erode morale, to plant fear like poison in their minds. This was Vlad's genius. He transformed cruelty into strategy. He turned terror into a weapon as sharp as any sword. For Vlad the Impaler, war was not just fought with armies. It was fought with fear. But every weapon has a price. And while terror kept his enemies at bay, it also began to shape his legend in ways Vlad could not control. Stories of his cruelty spread beyond Wallachia, whispered in Hungarian taverns, written in German pamphlets, carried across Europe like wildfire. Some tales were true, others exaggerated beyond recognition. But all painted the same picture: Vlad Dracula, the Impaler Prince, a ruler who bathed his land in blood. And yet, within Wallachia, peasants still prayed for him. Mothers still told children to fear his wrath but bless his name. To them, he was no mere butcher. He was the wall that stood against the tide that would drown them all. The reign of Vlad the Impaler was a paradox: salvation through terror, order through blood, justice through cruelty. But as his defiance grew louder, the Ottoman shadow grew darker. Soon, Vlad's war of fear would ignite into full-scale conflict. The boy who had once been a hostage was about to challenge an empire. The year was 1462. The stage was set for a clash unlike any other. On one side, the mighty Ottoman Empire, vast, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable. On the other, Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, a ruler of a fractured land, with only tens of thousands of soldiers at his command. It was David against Goliath. But David carried not just a stone. He carried terror. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, was no ordinary ruler. He was the man who had taken Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and cementing Ottoman dominance. For him, Wallachia was not a threat. It was a nuisance to be crushed. He assembled one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, over 150,000 soldiers, accompanied by cavalry, janissaries, engineers, and heavy artillery. Against them, Vlad could muster perhaps 30,000 men. But he had something the Ottomans did not: knowledge of the land, the will to fight to the last breath, and a weapon as invisible as it was devastating. Fear. Vlad's strategy was scorched earth. As the Ottomans advanced, he ordered villages burned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. Livestock were slaughtered or driven into the mountains. The land itself became a wasteland, offering nothing to the invaders. Starvation, exhaustion, and disease began to gnaw at the Ottoman horde before a single major battle had been fought. But it was not enough to weaken their bodies. Vlad wanted to break their spirit. Everywhere the Ottomans marched, they found death. Entire villages impaled, their inhabitants arranged in grotesque displays. A mother skewered beside her child, a priest beside his altar, soldiers in full armor, dangling like grotesque scarecrows. The most infamous of these spectacles came near the city of Targovist. As Mehmed's army approached, they encountered what chroniclers called the Forest of the Impaled. 20,000 corpses lined the roads, their bodies swaying on sharpened poles, stretching as far as the eye could see. The smell of rot choked the air, vultures circled overhead, and the silence of the dead pressed upon every living man. Even the hardened Mehmed was shaken. He stared at the spectacle, and though he pressed forward, he knew he was not merely facing an enemy. He was facing a nightmare given flesh. It was not just war. It was theater. It was terror carved into the earth. But Vlad's genius was not only in spectacle. He used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and psychological tricks to sow panic. He struck at night, vanishing into forests, leaving only bodies behind. His most daring assault came in June of 1462, remembered as the night attack. On that night, Vlad led a force of perhaps 7,000 men against a massive Ottoman camp. Under cover of darkness, his soldiers dressed in Ottoman uniforms infiltrated the camp and launched a surprise attack. Fires erupted, confusion spread, and panic took hold. Vlad himself charged forward, aiming directly for the Sultan's tent. His goal was nothing less than assassination. Though he failed to kill Mehmed, the attack caused havoc. Thousands of Ottomans died in their sleep, others killed each other in confusion. By dawn, the great camp was smeared with blood and littered with corpses. The Ottomans, unnerved and humiliated, realized they were facing a commander unlike any they had ever known. But terror is a double-edged sword. While it weakened his enemies, it also isolated Vlad. To Christian Europe, his defiance of the Ottomans was admirable, but his methods, forests of the impaled, rivers of blood, were disturbing, almost satanic. Pamphlets began to circulate, painting him as a sadist who delighted in suffering. Stories grew, that he boiled men alive, that he dined among impaled corpses, that he dipped his bread in their blood. Some were exaggerations, others outright lies, but together they built a legend darker than truth itself. Meanwhile, at home, his brutality created enemies. Nobles feared him, peasants respected him but trembled, and even neighboring rulers began to plot. Among them was his own brother, Radu the Handsome, who had chosen the Ottoman side. Charismatic and pliant, Radu was everything Vlad was not: charming where Vlad was cruel, diplomatic where Vlad was brutal. The Ottomans saw in him a perfect puppet, and many Wallachian boyars betrayed Vlad to support Radu's claim to the throne. By the end of 1462, Vlad's brilliant campaign had reached its limit. He could not defeat the Ottomans outright, nor could he hold Wallachia against betrayal from within. Exhausted, outnumbered, and surrounded by enemies, Vlad was forced to retreat. He sought aid from Hungary, from King Matthias Corvinus, hoping that his defiance against the Ottomans would earn him support. Instead, Matthias arrested him. Vlad the Impaler, scourge of the Ottomans, terror of Europe, prince of fear, was thrown into a Hungarian prison. His enemies rejoiced. His brother Radu, with Ottoman backing, claimed the throne of Wallachia. For a time, it seemed the legend of Vlad Dracula was over. But even in chains, his story refused to die. Because men like Vlad are not buried so easily. His name, his legend, his terror, they had already escaped him, traveling across borders, whispered in markets, etched into chronicles. The world could not forget him, even if it tried, and as the years passed, as Europe changed and wars shifted, Vlad waited. Chains could hold his body, but they could not extinguish the fire that had burned in him since childhood. The fire of vengeance. The fire of survival. The fire of fear. Even legends must end. The story of Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Terror and Protector alike, approached its final chapter not with fanfare, but with betrayal, blood, and the silence of history. Yet even in death, his shadow would stretch across centuries. After his imprisonment in Hungary, Vlad was eventually released in 1475. A prince hardened by captivity, aged by war, and scarred by betrayal, he returned to a Wallachia still fractured, still teetering between the Ottomans and rival claimants. His mind, once consumed by immediate survival, now weighed carefully every move. Revenge, restoration, and survival were intertwined, a delicate dance along the knife edge of politics and blood. He reclaimed the throne briefly, ruling once again with the same blend of order and terror that had defined his earlier reigns. Villages were rebuilt, roads maintained, the state stabilized. Yet his enemies never forgot. The boyars who survived his first reign plotted silently, always seeking allies to depose him. The Ottomans, wounded in pride but persistent, watched, waiting for the moment to strike, and then, in 1476, the end came not with armies, but with assassination. Vlad was ambushed near Bucharest, attacked by rival forces loyal to the Ottomans. He fought bravely, wielding sword and courage, but even the strongest men are mortal. His body was pierced by multiple weapons, and he fell in the blood-soaked soil of his kingdom. His exact resting place remains unknown, a secret lost to time. Only whispered legends speak of his grave, hidden somewhere in the forests he loved and terrorized. Yet the death of Vlad Dracula did not erase his story. If anything, it ignited it. Chroniclers, poets, and fearful witnesses preserved tales of his cruelty, his cunning, and his unyielding justice. Some described him as a savior who defended Wallachia from the Ottoman tide. Others painted him as a devil incarnate, a man who delighted in pain. Europe trembled at the name, Dracula, and it became a symbol of horror that would endure for centuries. Vlad's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and survival. He was a man forged by trauma, a hostage of the Ottomans, a witness to his family's murder, a ruler surrounded by treachery. His methods were monstrous by modern standards, yet in his mind, they were necessary. He believed that fear was the only language the world understood, and that only through the absolute application of law could Wallachia survive. To the ordinary people of Wallachia, he was paradoxical. He could kill without hesitation, yet he ensured their villages were safe, their roads passable, their lives protected. He could impale traitors in gruesome public spectacles, yet he defended his land from foreign invaders more effectively than many kings with far larger armies. To them, Vlad Dracula was terrifying, but he was also a necessary evil, a dragon whose fire kept even greater dangers at bay. And so, history remembers him not as a simple villain, but as a complex figure. A man of contradictions, protector and executioner, prince and monster, savior and terror. The legend of Vlad the Impaler did not fade with his death, it transformed. Stories of his cruelty reached the imagination of writers and artists across Europe.